I'm Nima Rajan. Officials say it remains unclear if two Canadians accused of spying in China will have additional hearings following their first court appearances after 2 years in custody. Former diplomat Michael Kovrig went on trial in Beijing on Monday, days after Michael Spavor appeared in court on Friday. No verdicts have been announced, and Canadian diplomats were denied access to the trials because of alleged national security concerns. Meanwhile, the opposition is denouncing the Liberal government's handling of the case of the two Michaels. In question period, Deputy Conservative leader Candice Bergen accused the Liberals of using the imprisonment of the two Canadians in China as an excuse not to deal with the regime's human rights abuses. Canada is joining the U.S., the EU, and the United Kingdom in levying sanctions against China over its actions against Uyghur Muslims. The federal government says mounting evidence points to state-led abuses by Chinese authorities against more than 1 million Uyghurs and other Muslim ethnic minorities based on their religion and ethnicity. The House of Commons voted last month to declare the atrocities a genocide, though the Prime Minister and all but one member of his cabinet did not take part in the vote. More transmissible variants of COVID-19 continue to pop up across Canada, and that has top health officials on edge. Still, many are hoping that the country's vaccination program can put a dent in the spread of the virus and its variant cousins. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has praised the immunization effort, which he said has delivered more than 4.7 million doses to the provinces thus far, allowing families across the country to have some relief. The rising rates of incarceration in some provincial jail systems are drawing sharp criticism from a group of advocates for Canadian prisoners. More than 7,000 cases of COVID-19 have been linked to Canadian jails and prisons. At the start of the pandemic, inmate populations across the country fell in an effort to better enable physical distancing. But since last summer, most provincial and territorial systems have started putting more people back in jail. The National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations is calling on the RCMP to make changes, including in oversight and in member recruitment. Perry Bellegarde's comments came after a news conference held by the mother of Colton Boushie, a 22-year-old Indigenous man who was shot and killed in 2016 when the SUV he was riding in entered the property of a Saskatchewan farmer. A commission looking into how the police handled the case ruled officers treated Debbie Baptiste so insensitively when they notified her of her son's death that it amounted to discrimination. A former top aide to Stephen Harper says investigations about allegations of misconduct by General Jonathan Vance were carried out before his appointment as Chief of the Defense Staff in 2015. Ray Novak told the Commons Defense Committee investigations failed to turn up any evidence of wrongdoing before Mr. Vance took over as commander of the Canadian Armed Forces. Mr. Novak told MPs digging into allegations of sexual misconduct that the Harper government was tipped in March 2015 that Mr. Vance had a relationship with a U.S. military officer while posted in Italy, but there was no sign of wrongdoing. Independent Senator Mary Lou McPhedran says a new policy meant to protect Senate staffers from workplace harassment is worse than the existing one and will silence victims. Her concern revolves around the requirement that all participants in a third-party investigation would be bound to confidentiality, with vague threats of disciplinary action for anyone who violates it. Senator Raymond St. Germain, chair of the subcommittee that drafted the new policy, says the confidentiality requirement is aimed primarily at assuring complainants that their privacy will be protected. Industry analysts say CP Rail's proposed $25 billion acquisition of Kansas City Southern has a good chance of being approved by regulators because there is little overlap between the two lines. The deal would create the first railroad to link Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. One independent railroad analyst says the merger of the two smallest of the major railroads into one entity should help stabilize the industry overall. The companies estimate the merger will result in $800 million U.S. in annual revenue growth within 3 years. An Alberta pastor jailed for violating a bail condition to comply with pandemic health orders is free without conditions. James Coates of Grace Life Church pleaded guilty to a charge of breaching bail and was fined $1,500. However, a judge said that the 35 days Mr. Coates had spent in custody would count as credit for the entire fine. Pastor Coates was charged in February after his church west of Edmonton was alleged to have violated public health measures meant to help contain the spread of COVID-19. All right, stay with us. More to come as we dissect yesterday's court proceedings in Beijing, China, in the case of Michael Kovrig and last Friday's trial of Michael Spavor. We speak with Mr. Charles Burton, Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, when we return after the break. So stay with us. That and more news from around the world coming up next. So stay tuned. Former diplomat Michael Kovrig was put on trial yesterday in Beijing on spying charges. As was the case with fellow detainee Michael Spavor's trial last Friday, Canadian officials were barred from the courtroom. No verdicts have been announced, and Canadian diplomats were denied access to the trials because of alleged national security concerns. However, it is still unclear if the two Canadians will have additional hearings following their first court appearances after 2 years in custody. It is widely believed that Beijing is using the pair as leverage to obtain the release of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou, who was arrested at Vancouver's airport in December of 2018 at the request of the U.S. Meanwhile, the opposition is denouncing the Liberal government's handling of the case of the two Michaels. Well, to talk more on the recent developments in the detention of the two Michaels, we are joined by Mr. Charles Burton, Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Always great to have you on the show, Mr. Burton.
Very nice to speak with you, Nima.
Now, all eyes are on these trials in Beijing, but Canadian officials can't enter the courtroom. So what information has China released so far?
Well, nothing really. We assume that they will be convicted, but the verdict has not been handed out. And we also don't know when sentencing will be handed down. So really, from our point of view, it's more or less a non-event. Mr. Kovrak and Mr. Spavor came out of prison, went to this process that we know nothing about, had no opportunity to defend themselves. We don't know really what the details of the charges are. And they go back to prison. And my speculation would be they will stay in prison until such time as the Chinese government feels it's in the interests of China to release them. So, it's an unfortunate sequence of events and really a travesty of the principles of justice and due process of law.
Now, considering that this whole detention is widely viewed as retaliation from China over the arrest of Meng Wanzhou, how likely are the trials of Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig going to be connected to the outcome of Ms. Meng's case?
Well, I think that certainly it's possible that if some sort of deferred prosecution agreement is worked out between the American government and Ms. Meng and the Huawei company, that we might be able to put in a rider requiring the release of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. But if the judicial process continues according to normal Canadian law, in other words, that the determination of whether or not Ms. Meng's extradition request under the extradition treaty is valid, and it's found it's not valid, and she's therefore free to go, I don't think that we'll necessarily see the release of Kovrig and Spavor because the Chinese government continues to want to express their displeasure with Canada over our arrest of a senior Chinese member of the Chinese Communist Party, and because it seems to be serving their interest in Canada, because it's constrained the Canadian government from taking much substantive action against the Chinese regime for various violations of the ordinary rules of the international order.
Now, we have opposition leaders criticizing the Liberal government's handling of this matter. Was there a better way to go about handling the situation?
Well, I wouldn't want anyone to think that the horrendous fate of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor is due to the Canadian government. I mean, clearly it's on the heads of the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party that they've been subject to brutal incarceration for such a long time. But clearly our original policy of quiet diplomacy, which is do nothing to displease the Chinese regime while engaging in backroom negotiations, hoping to have the Chinese Communist regime see reason and act with goodwill and release Kovrak and Spavor, has failed because, after all, they've now been imprisoned for 833 days. So I think that the opposition is right to demand that our government review our China policy and see if we can make some changes to give the Chinese government incentive to release Kovrig and Spavor, and in general to abide more by the norms of reciprocal, fair, and just interchange in global affairs.
Now, we've got about 45 seconds left, sir, but dozens of diplomats from 26 countries sent representatives in Beijing to show their support. Is there any way that we could utilize this international support in our efforts to return the two Michaels?
I think it's heartening to see so many diplomats accompanying our chargé d'affaires, Jim Nicol, at the courthouse, standing around for hours in the cold. In April, the U.S. will be convoking a summit of democracies where ostensibly the idea is to protect the norms of the international rules-based order. But what it really is a lot of our like-minded allies coming up with some coordinated action to give the Chinese government pressure to get more into compliance with norms of diplomacy.
BC's provincial health officer, Dr. Bonnie Henry, is not declaring a third wave of COVID-19, despite rising case numbers and growing variants of concern.
While more and more people are getting vaccinated every day, it's very important that the risk for all of us remains high. And we see that in our 7-day rolling average. We see that in the increasing that we've seen over the last few weeks. We ask about whether we're in a third wave. It really is. We've come down from the peak of our second wave, but we have leveled out for many weeks now, and it's a slow and steady increase.
Dr. Henry says there were 1,785 new cases over the past 3 days, and 166 of those were variants of concern, primarily the strain first detected in the UK. However, she says variants are not driving transmission, but rather cases are gradually being replaced with variants. BC's minister responsible for housing says an agreement with the City of Victoria to end current and future homeless encampments is a potential blueprint for similar deals. David Eby says the Memorandum of Understanding formalizes a commitment to find indoor shelter for people living in parks and other outdoor areas by April 30th. While the deal in Victoria was forged out of crisis, Mr. Eby says he's hopeful similar agreements will become common in other cities. A man facing a first-degree murder charge in the death of an Alberta doctor will have his mental health reviewed again. Deng Mabior was initially deemed fit to stand trial, but the Alberta Review Board will assess him further. Crown Prosecutor Bina Boulder told the court that she received a letter from a psychiatrist last week that indicated Mr. Mabior had attended an appointment at the Tom Baker Cancer Centre for a serious medical condition. Court of Queen's Bench Justice Paul Belzil asked the Crown to write to the doctor to find out how bad Mr. Mabior's condition is. Alberta's health minister says the province won't further ease COVID-19 health restrictions for now. Tyler Shandro says hospitalizations are steadily rising and are likely to soon surpass the 300 key benchmark for lifting more restrictions. Premier Jason Kenney has faced demands, including from members of his own caucus, to ease up on the rules. The opposition says the government made the right call in delaying changes, but adds that it still needs to show Albertans the modeling data used in making decisions. Richardson International has announced big plans for a canola crushing plant in eastern Saskatchewan. The company says it is doubling the size of its plant in Yorkton to 2.2 million tons, making it the largest in Canada. Work on the expansion is to start shortly, with completion set for 2024. Agriculture Minister David Merritt says the expansion helps meet a provincial goal of crushing 75% of the canola produced in Saskatchewan. Families at 7 different Winnipeg schools have received public health letters within the past week about exposures to COVID-19 variants of concerns. Chief Public Health Officer Dr. Brent Rusin says all cases are quarantining, and so are affected classrooms and cohorts. When asked about the potential for school closures, Dr. Rusin says nothing is off the table as the province evaluates the situation. Dr. Rusin says the province's COVID-19 school dashboard will include variant breakdowns by the end of the week. Well, there is light at the end of the COVID-19 tunnel for Ontario restaurateurs, with outdoor dining now permitted everywhere in the province. However, the vice president of Central Canada for Restaurants Canada cautions impact on restaurants in the Toronto area, where indoor dining continues to be prohibited, will largely depend on the spring weather. Food and drink establishments in the province's second strictest red category can increase capacity to 50 people indoors, while restaurants in orange zones can now have 100 people indoors. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says there is no place in Canada for the kind of ignorance and inexcusable hate demonstrated by homophobic graffiti painted on the road in front of the home of Ottawa Mayor Jim Watson. Mr. Watson, who became Ottawa's longest-serving mayor on Saturday, came out as a gay man in August of 2019. The Ottawa Police Hate Crimes Unit is investigating. Atlantic Canada is still seeing its COVID-19 numbers tick higher. Health officials in New Brunswick are reporting 8 new cases, while Nova Scotia and PEI are tallying 2 new cases each. In New Brunswick, one of the positive cases was confirmed at Moncton High School, while 2 others were identified at 2 childcare facilities in Edmundston. A judge has ruled New Brunswick must share a portion of carbon tax revenues with the province's 6 Wolastoqey First Nations. Last year, the province introduced a carbon tax but reduced the existing tax rates on gasoline and diesel to offset most of the increase, and advised First Nations that would mean a reduction in their share. But Justice Richard Petrie of the Court of Queen's Bench ruled the agreements with the First Nations include all taxes on gasoline and other fuels, including the carbon tax. All right, we take a look at what's making news around the world after the break, starting with a mass shooting in Boulder, Colorado. Meanwhile, Israel votes in a general election, and a Scottish committee votes that the First Minister misled lawmakers. That and more coming up next. Police in Boulder, Colorado say the investigation has just begun following a shooting rampage that left 10 people dead. A suspect has been arrested, but police did not reveal his name or any details about the shooting.
We know of 10 fatalities at the scene, including one of our Boulder PD officers by the name of Eric Talley, who's been on the Boulder Police Department since 2010. He's served in numerous roles supporting the Boulder Police Department and the community of Boulder.
The attack was the 7th mass killing in the U.S. this year. U.S. airlines are putting pressure on the Biden administration to come up with a plan to reduce restrictions on international travel. More than 24 groups representing airlines and others in the tourism industry made their demands in a letter Monday to a top White House official. The groups say people who have been vaccinated against COVID-19 should be exempt from testing requirements before entering the U.S. They also want the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to say it is safe for vaccinated people to travel. Israelis are voting in a highly charged election considered a referendum on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Mr. Netanyahu is campaigning on his stewardship of Israel's world-leading vaccination drive against COVID-19, as well as the diplomatic accords with 4 Arab nations. His opponents say Mr. Netanyahu is unfit to serve while he is fighting corruption charges, and that he is seeking new elections to protect himself from prosecution. Opinion polls have forecast a tight contest, and results might not be known for days. A Scottish parliamentary investigation says First Minister Nicola Sturgeon misled lawmakers about sexual harassment allegations against her predecessor. Lawmakers have been investigating the Scottish government's handling of sexual harassment allegations against former First Minister Alex Salmond. A report says Ms. Sturgeon gave lawmakers an inaccurate account of what happened at a key meeting with Mr. Salmond in 2018 and misled the committee on this matter. The finding came a day after a separate inquiry cleared Ms. Sturgeon of wrongdoing in the scandal that is rocking Scottish politics weeks before a crucial election. Tensions in the South China Sea are ramping up. The U.S. says it is backing the Philippines in a new standoff with Beijing after Manila asked a Chinese fishing flotilla to leave a local reef. China ignored the call, insisting that it owns the offshore territory. China says the roughly 200 vessels were avoiding rough waters, but the U.S. says the numbers of vessels there have been growing in all weather. A child relief agency says children constituted a quarter of civilian casualties over the last 3 years in Yemen's war between the Iran-backed Houthi rebels and the internationally recognized government. More than 2,300 children were killed between 2018 and 2020. That is according to a new study by Save the Children. However, the group said that the actual toll is likely to be much higher. The organization's country director says the Yemeni children have been living through a horrific and endless nightmare for 6 years now. New Zealand will spend billions of dollars to encourage more home building and will also remove some tax breaks for speculators as it tries to slow skyrocketing housing prices. The government has announced a series of new measures to address what Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern is describing as a crisis. Prices had been expected to dip due to the coronavirus pandemic, but instead they have continued to rise. It's made New Zealand among the most unaffordable in the world when compared with people's incomes. Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey has sold a digital version of his first tweet for more than $2.9 million. The tweet dates back to March 2006 and simply says, "Just setting up my Twitter." The company that ran the digital auction says it was purchased by the CEO of Bridge Oracle. The 15-year-old post was sold as a non-fungible token, or NFT, which is a digital certificate of authenticity. Mr. Dorsey says proceeds will be converted to Bitcoin, which is a digital currency that isn't tied to a bank or government. Canadian actor Sandra Oh gave a powerful speech at a Stop Asian Hate protest in Oakland, Pennsylvania over the weekend. The two-time Golden Globe Award winner, who is of Korean heritage, said she is grateful to those who are willing to listen to the feelings of fear and anger many in her community are experiencing. Ms. Oh also challenged those at the rally to help aid their sisters and brothers in need. The former Grey's Anatomy star concluded the speech by saying that she is proud to be Asian. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and make sure to follow us on our social media handles on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can also watch all of our news and commentary programming on the News Forum YouTube channel. All right, thanks for joining us on the Forum Daily, everyone, and we will see you next time. Take care.